I will be talking about medical marijuana, and is it the medical panacea some hope it to be? And I thought I would start off basically giving you some context here about why this is important, why should you care. And actually, Congressman Polis basically hit some of these points already. But in a nutshell, the reason it's important is because this is now a major public health issue. And of course, if you look at the map here of the United States, what you see in the dark green, you see states that have legalized for recreational or for medical purposes. And as the shades get lighter, basically you see medical marijuana only, and then more restrictions in terms of medical marijuana. But the overarching point here, and to make this a little bit more personal, right, the reason why you should care is that no matter what state you're from, no matter what community you're from, you probably know somebody with cancer, right, who has questions about cannabis, or you know somebody who's been using cannabis who has cancer. And that's true for any state, regardless of the legality. Same thing for veterans, right? Veterans across the country are turning to cannabis. And of course, families with children with epilepsy obviously have questions about cannabidiol, which was one of the major cannabinoids in cannabis. This is the cannabinoid that doesn't get you high, but may be useful for seizures. So all these people, obviously, this is an important issue, and we all know people like this. Okay, so here's the question, right? In a perfect world, what would happen would be we would do the science, we would do the research, right? And that science would get disseminated out to people who need the information to make rational decisions about whether or not to use cannabis. But the way this works currently, right, is that people get their information elsewhere. So, for example, where do veterans get their information about the effects of cannabis in terms of PTSD? Well, probably they get it from Google, right? So they type in marijuana and PTSD treatment, and so what are the top 3 hits? What do they see? Well, they see marijuanadoctors.com, right? They see psychologytoday.com. They see hightimes.com, right? So that's where, potentially they're getting their information about PTSD and cannabis. And of course, the point here is that surely we can do better. Okay, so the overarching question posed in the title, is it the medical panacea some hope it to be? And I thought I would just take a few minutes to sort of reframe that question, right? Because the patient with cancer walks into their doctor's office, they're not asking the question, is medical marijuana a panacea, right? They want to know what are the risks and side effects, what are the potential benefits? Because that's what we all do, right? We want to basically make a decision weighing the risks and the benefits. So I thought I would reframe the question and sort of organize the talk around those 2 principles. So talking about the potential risks and side effects, and then talking about the benefits. And I thought I would start off first by giving you some history, some background. So, where am I coming from when I approach this question? And again, then talk some about the risks, the research, our own research on the risks, and also the research literature on the risks, and then talk some about the potential benefits. And then importantly, because there isn't a lot of research on the benefits, we're going to talk about why there isn't a lot of research on the benefits. What are the obstacles to research? So I've been doing this now in the general field of substance use for 20 plus years since leaving Brown to go to Colorado. And I had a much more traditional sort of perspective on substance use. But then in 2012, 2013, when Colorado legalized for recreational purposes, my mind changed a little bit, my position changed a little bit. And it wasn't so much that we legalized, it was what happened after legalization. And what happened after legalization is there were lots of news stories about families with small children, medical marijuana refugees, if you will, moving to Colorado in order to get cannabis-derived cannabidiol to help with their children who have seizures. And then, you have to sort of reconcile that with the traditional, perspective on cannabis, right? The traditional perspective was, well, it destroys your brain, it knocks points off your IQ, takes away your motivation, as exemplified here in the movie Dazed and Confused. So very diametrically opposed sort of perspectives on what cannabis is all about. And it made me think about this quote from Socrates. I know one thing, but I know nothing, right? Basically, to me, this is an indication that we need to rethink our perspective on cannabis. And really the smart thing was to ignore what we thought we knew, start over with a blank slate, and then get the data to really figure out what's going on with cannabis. So we basically retooled some of our research. And we first wanted to understand the effects of cannabis on the brain. So my background is clinical neuroscience. We've done a lot of neuroimaging, so putting people in an MRI and looking at their brain in the MRI. And so we thought we'd take a closer look at the question of whether or not cannabis impacts brain morphology and brain function. So we basically came up with a sample, a study where we had 29 adult non-marijuana users, and we compared them to 29 adult daily users. And we did the same thing with adolescents. We had 50 adolescents who were non-users and 50 who were daily users. Now, the thing that we did slightly differently in this study compared to other studies that have been published before was we matched these groups very carefully on other variables, right? So you can imagine that adolescents who use cannabis also use alcohol, for example, right? And that's kind of an important confound when it comes to the brain. So in this case, what distinguished these groups was not comorbid alcohol use, it was simply cannabis use. Again, they were matched on alcohol and other variables. What we found, both in adults and adolescents, was no differences in brain morphology based on whether they were daily users or not users at all. And that was published back in 2014. So we thought, okay, let's follow up on this, right? We have a lot more brain imaging data. Let's do a more sophisticated analysis. So in this analysis, we had a total of 1,336 brain scans, right? People have been through the MRI scanner. And for the adults, we had 345 marijuana users, 190 of which use more than once a week. And for adolescents, 275 users, 198 who use more than once a week. And the idea was to do two things here. One was to analyze the data, analyze the effect of alcohol while controlling for cannabis use, and then also to analyze the effect of cannabis while controlling for alcohol use. So we can basically look at both alcohol and cannabis, right? And this was published last year. So here's the money shot of the results. Now, here we're looking at gray matter. So gray matter basically is the neuronal cell bodies, right, in the brain. We're looking at the density of neuronal cell bodies. And on the left side of the screen, you see the effects of alcohol. On the right side, you see the effects of cannabis. And where you see color, that's basically part of the brain that shows a reduction in gray matter associated with alcohol use or cannabis use. And what you can see here is pervasive effects of alcohol on gray matter density, but no significant effects of cannabis, right? So again, looking at alcohol controlling for cannabis, we see effects of alcohol. If we look at cannabis and control for alcohol, we don't see any effects of cannabis in terms of gray matter density. When we look at white matter, these are the fiber bundles that basically connect different parts of the brain. We're looking at the integrity of these white matter bundles. When we look at white matter integrity, again, we see pervasive effects of alcohol and no effects of cannabis. With adolescents, we see no effects of alcohol, we see no effects of cannabis. Not too surprising when you think about it, right? Because adolescents, their alcohol use career has just started, right? So they've only been using alcohol for a few years. Same with cannabis. When we look at adolescents and white matter, we're beginning to see some effects of alcohol on white matter, but no effects of cannabis on white matter. So this question of, is cannabis bad for the brain? If you look at the studies that have large sample sizes, like our studies, there's no consistent evidence that cannabis use causes long-term pervasive changes in brain morphology. So if you look in the literature, you will see some studies that suggest there is an association. Mostly those studies have small sample sizes, and possibly, there's some potential for confirmation bias in literature. If you average over all those small studies, and we've done some of this too, again, you see little evidence for an effect of cannabis on brain morphology. So one important caveat, right? Absence of evidence, not necessarily evidence of absence. So just because we're not seeing it now doesn't mean we won't see it in the future. Maybe as our approaches become more sophisticated, maybe as a result of, higher potency cannabis. So, just keep that caveat in mind. But for now, I think the message is it's important to question the conclusions of previous studies, especially small studies that suggest an association. Okay, so that's great. We did this research a few years ago. Here's the thing. This is true for our research and true for other people's research. There's a lot of variables that have not been examined, right? So some really important variables. So for example, potency of marijuana, dose of marijuana, the cannabinoid and terpene profile. So if you look at marijuana, what's in the flower, it ranges, right? There's 80 plus cannabinoids, terpenes. We know a lot about THC. We know something about CBD. but there's a lot of others that we don't know a lot about, right? And it's quite variable in terms of that mix of physiologically active cannabinoids and terpenes. So type of product, right? In Colorado, we have flower, we have edibles, we have topicals, we have concentrates and oils. Nobody's really looked at what is going on with these different routes of administration. And then finally, I'll talk some about this today. The risks and benefits of these products may differ, right, between medical users and recreational users. So obviously the medical user and recreational user, they're coming at this from very different perspectives, right? One wants to get high. The medical users don't want to get high. They just want their neuropathic pain to go away, right? Or they want to control their opiate use. It's very, very different perspectives. So the bottom line is we recognized the fact that we need some new approaches to research the products that people are actually using in state-regulated markets. So we spent a couple of years working with our legal team at the University of Colorado to come up with a way that we could do this research. And obviously, there are a number of obstacles. So for example, we're not allowed to bring people on campus and have them use cannabis, right? That would be a violation of the Drug-Free Schools Act, Drug-Free Workplace Act. But the solution we came up with is, well, we can't bring people to campus, but we can bring our lab to the people, right? So the idea was we built this mobile pharmacology lab you see here. You know, the Sprinter van and the inside of the Sprinter van outfitted with a phlebotomy station, and we do all of our cognitive assessments in the van, all of our motor assessments, subjective assessments. So the idea is this is a way we can actually study what people are using. This actually was funded by NIDA, and I'm very grateful to them for sort of investing in this effort. And so let me give you some more details. We call this an observational study design. And what that means is basically we identify people who are currently regular users of cannabis. We do some baseline assessments, we draw their blood, and then we randomly assign them to one of a couple of products, right? So in the first study, it's basically 24% THC flower or 16% THC flower. So we're trying to get at the higher potency flower. What does it mean, right? What happens with higher potency flower? In the second phase of this effort, we're actually varying THC to CBD ratios. So that's one aspect of the study. The other is looking at higher or lower potency concentrate. So this is what people call dabbing, right? It's when you basically use a concentrated oil, right? And 70% or 90% THC. So the idea is they're randomly assigned to one of these products, regular users. They basically, they go and buy the product. We don't tell them how much to use. We don't tell them how to use it. This is more the observational part of the design. It's up to them to do whatever they normally do, right? For 5 days, they do whatever they normally do. We drive the van out to their residence. They come down, meet us. We draw the blood. We do the assessments before they use the product one last time. They go back to their house. They use the product. They come back to the van. We draw the blood again. We collect a whole range of assessments again over the next couple of hours, right? So what did the data look like? This is brand new data. We haven't published this yet, and this actually is quite new to the literature too. So what you see here is you see on this graph the blood levels of THC. So on the y-axis we have THC expressed in nanograms per milliliter, and you see at baseline people are close to 0, and then in the post-use time point, what you see is basically we have 4 groups. We have the 16% THC group, the 24% THC group, the 70% THC group, the 90% THC group. And you can see that the graph very much follows along in terms of blood levels and potency, right? People who are dabbing, who are using the concentrates, have much higher blood levels than people who are doing the flower. Now, I could have given you a graph where basically I cut off at 500 nanograms per mil, right? And you can see the difference is much better. But I went ahead and put this graph in here because I wanted you to see all these data points, right? These data points, these people, they're going up to 1,000 nanograms per mil, 1,500 nanograms per mil, 2,300 nanograms per mil, right? These are data points I don't think we've seen in the literature ever, right? And it gets at the sort of the value of this design, letting people do what they normally do. So that's very interesting, right? Again, differences in terms of potency map onto differences in blood levels. But what about the actual effects of these different products? So we do a variety of cognitive tasks. And one of the cognitive tasks that's most sensitive to the effects of cannabis is delayed verbal recall. So what that means is people memorize a list, and then some point later they have to remember the list, right, and tell us what the list was. So at baseline, people are pretty good at not making errors, right? After they use cannabis, errors definitely go up. Now, there are no significant differences here, but you can see, ironically, just in terms of mean values, the concentrate people actually are showing the fewest errors, right? Again, not significantly different. And by 90 minutes, they're really right on top of each other. But again, the contrast here is big changes in blood levels, not big changes in cognitive function. When we look at the subjective effects, what we see is something very similar. This is basically asking people how intoxicated or how high they are on a 0 to 10-point scale. Before they smoke, they're all hovering around 0. After they smoke, they're up around a 6 or 7, and they stay up there at 90 minutes after use. But again, you don't see this difference in the lines, right? The higher potency doesn't mean people are more intoxicated. It doesn't mean they're making more errors. So what does this mean then, right? Again, blood levels are different, but the functional effects are not. What it suggests is that these people have a very high level of tolerance, right? That the people who are doing the concentrates basically can take a lot more in and has the same functional effect. And so they're basically, looks like they're titrating to a certain effect. It's just that some have a higher tolerance than others. So it's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you could look at this and say, well, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of harmful effects with respect, to potency. People are basically doing the same. To me, it also suggests that we need to think about what's the long-term potential for harm. And this is the next study we need to do. So if it takes you 2,200 nanograms per mil to achieve a certain effect, that's not a good thing, right? It's not a good thing if you're a medical patient because it means you're not seeing the medical effects. It's just probably not a good thing for multiple reasons. We need to dig deeper in terms of that potential aspect of harm. Okay, so most of what I've talked about so far has been about recreational users, right? Again, in the U.S., there hasn't been much research at all on medical users, and again, they have a very different perspective. Interestingly enough, though, there is some literature we can look at in terms of risks of cannabis or medical marijuana in medical users. So in Canada and in multiple countries in Europe and around the world, Sativex has been approved now for quite some time. So in Canada, it was approved in 2005. Sativex is made by GW Pharma, and it's a plant-derived, so they take cannabis plants, they extract THC and CBD and combine it into an oral formulation, right? So it's basically a 1-to-1 ratio of THC and CBD. And the nice thing about this is, in these other countries where it's approved, there was a number of phase 3 clinical trials. There have been registries, post-marketing registries, so we can look at the safety profile of this drug in other countries. As a quick example, in the post-marketing registries, one registry has 941 patients, a mean of 954 days of use, mean dose of 14.6 milligrams of THC per day, and 13.5 milligrams of CBD per day. So what did they find in terms of adverse effects? Well, they found in the beginning, when patients first start using the medication, they do report some dizziness, some fatigue, right? But that dissipates over a few days. Most importantly, what they found was that there was no evidence of abuse liability or cognitive effects, right? Short-term or long-term cognitive effects. And I thought I would just, this is kind of interesting side note, right? This is Sativex here, made by GW Pharma in 2009. And interestingly enough, I found a bottle from Eli Lilly produced in 1909, right? And some interesting similarities there, but separated by 100 years. Okay, so just to summarize the potential risks in recreational users, high THC products or THC in general definitely can produce some short-term cognitive, negative effects. And certainly in recreational users, we know that there's some potential for misuse and some potential for marijuana use disorder. In medical users, the data that we have, suggests that for the most part, especially if you're talking about a product that's a combination of THC and CBD, we're not seeing those negative cognitive effects, and we're not seeing the misuse or abuse potential. And obviously in America, where people are using THC only, you can see some of the same short-term cognitive negative effects. But in general, it may be the case that CBD, when it's combined with THC, as it is in Sativex, mitigates some of those negative effects. Okay, so we've talked about risks Remember, we're weighing the risks and the benefits, right? Let's talk about the benefits. So I only have 35 minutes roughly, maybe a little bit less than that. Fortunately, the National Academy of Sciences produced a report on the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids about a year and a half ago, and I was on the committee that did that. Very comprehensive. So I'm referring you to this document if you want to know more about the health effects. To hit the highlights, the committee found conclusive evidence that cannabis was at least modestly effective for chronic pain and chemotherapy-induced nausea and MS spasticity, and moderate evidence for improving sleep outcomes. So again, I refer you to that report if you want to know more. I'm going to hit just the highlights of two aspects, epilepsy and the opiate epidemic, because I think that's a salient problem that as a nation we're struggling with right now. So let's talk for a second about epilepsy. So if you've been following the news here in DC, you know that less than 3 weeks ago, there was a hearing on the Hill where an FDA committee reviewed the evidence for a marijuana-derived drug, as you see here in the headline, which is cannabidiol, for epilepsy. And they voted 11-0 to recommend that this drug move forward, right? So that was 3 weeks ago. What you may not know is that, you may not know the literature on cannabidiol and seizures. And the interesting thing here, right, is that this committee report pushing this forward, recommending this cannabidiol for epilepsy, took place 3 weeks ago. But the original research, 1973, in the 1970s, right? 1970s. So when I was thinking about this, and part of this comes from talking to families with children with seizure disorders. I mean, it's to me, the fact it took 45 years to get from the research, the basic research, to a drug that's going to reach actual families, that's a failure in my book in terms of science and in terms of public policy, right? And a cautionary tale in the sense that here we are now in 2018 with the opiate epidemic, right? And so there's this question out there, can cannabinoids be used to address the opiate epidemic? You heard Congressman Polis mention that. A lot of people are interested in this question. And why are people thinking this might be a good idea? Well, we know that pain management is central to the opiate epidemic. And I already told you that there are several high-quality reviews suggesting that cannabis products might be effective for pain, right? So that's already a couple of data points suggesting it might be useful. Here's some additional evidence. The interesting thing is that there are surveys out there, published data, suggesting that cannabis is already being used to reduce opiates, right? So no matter what the science says, no matter what policymakers say, people are already doing it. And so this survey here that came out published last year, what you see here is basically 97% of the people who answered this survey said that they were able to use cannabis to reduce opiate use, right? And so this is not the only study. There's like 3 or 4 out there, and we have data too consistent with this. People are reporting that they're using cannabis to reduce opiate use. Now, we don't have any objective evidence that's effective, but people certainly think it is. The interesting thing is when you look, and I think he mentioned this too, Congressman Polis, stole some of my thunder here, but this was published like a month ago or less than a month ago, right? This paper in JAMA Internal Medicine. So states with active dispensaries see 3.742 million fewer daily doses of opiates than states without active dispensaries. And again, this is not the only study. There's like 3 or 4 now suggesting that medical marijuana basically results in fewer prescriptions. And even if you look at this paper down here, less overdose mortality. So to quickly summarize on the cannabis and opiate front, again, data suggests that cannabis products can be effective in reducing pain. Data suggests that people are already using cannabis to reduce pain and reduce opiate use. Prescription studies back this up in terms of fewer prescriptions. Obviously, we don't know the answer, but certainly adds up, to I think a strong hypothesis that cannabis products might be useful for reducing opiate use. That's a clinical study that clearly needs to be done. Okay, so just an overall summary, right? We're weighing the risk and the benefits, right? We talked about the brain. Again, no consistent evidence to suggest that cannabis has a deleterious effect on the brain. For cognition in the short term, products high in THC, especially used for recreational reasons, they can have a short-term negative effect on cognition, also some abuse liability. But but this is not necessarily true in patients, and especially not in patients who are using a combination of THC and CBD. On the benefit side, we talked about pain, right? Pain, several reviews suggesting that pain can be at least modestly, that cannabinoids can be modestly effective for pain, also nausea, also sleep. Opiate use, misuse, still an open question. PTSD, an open question. And so clearly, hopefully what this is adding up for everybody here is that we need more research on the medical benefits side. And we certainly, in my group, we've been trying to address this and trying to address this issue of THC and CBD, right? Can CBD mitigate some of the risks, potentially add to some of the benefits? And so we're currently comparing different ratios of THC to CBD in medical patients and in users in general to look at the risks and the benefits. That's funded by NIDA. We also have a study on cannabis and lower back pain. This actually was funded by NCCIH, and they literally were just out yesterday to do a site visit and making sure that we checked all the boxes. They've been extremely diligent at NCCIH and NIDA to make sure that we are doing this work consistent with federal law. And also we're doing some work on anxiety mechanisms in cannabis funded by NIDA. But here are three things that I think are important to look at in the future. One is the neurocognitive effects of cannabis in cancer patients. So actually I was down at Anschutz in Denver with the medical school at a breast cancer clinic. And the nurses there ask every patient about their cannabis use. And so I asked the nurse, I said, well, what would you say, what percentage of patients say, yes, I'm using cannabis? She said easily 2/3, right? 2/3 of people. So this to me, and this is actually, we're working with a lung cancer doctor also, same kind of thing, right? Lots of cancer patients are using cannabis, but we know nothing about that, right? So cancer patients, obviously they're dealing with chemo, they've got chemo brain, there's all kinds of things going on. What is the result, what's going on here? Is it good, is it bad? Which products are good, which products are bad? We know nothing about the risks and benefits. I already made the case for cannabis and opiate use. Here's another one, though, for you, aging and cognition. So you may not know this, but the demographic group that's increasing the fastest in terms of cannabis use is the over 60 group, right? So why is that? What's going on there? Is it, being used to control pain or inflammation? What are the cognitive effects, right? We have no idea. Nobody's doing this work. So again, the bottom line is, there's not enough research. We need more research. Despite widespread acceptance, there's very little research being conducted in the US. So we have the situation where the medical use in state-regulated markets are far, far ahead of the research on efficacy and safety. And the way I like to frame this, I hope you like my little cartoon here, it's the medical marijuana cart has been placed right in front of the horse. It shouldn't be that way, right? The research efficacy and safety horse should be in front of the cart leading the way. That's not how it works in this country, right? So how does it work in this country? So this is the world that I live in as a scientist in Colorado, right? So I pulled these data actually from 2017, so these data are now a year old. In Colorado, each month, we cultivate 992,000 plus marijuana plants, right? It's close to 1 million marijuana plants per month cultivated in Colorado. 34,000 plus pounds of flower sold per month. 960,000 edible units sold per month. We have a state law in Colorado. This is actually Governor Hickenlooper signed this law called Jack's Law that basically allows school districts to permit medical cannabis on school grounds, right? So all this can happen in Colorado. But the University of Colorado, where we have, Nobel-winning physicists and chemists, our best chemists can't touch it. If our chemists want to know, are there contaminants? Is it safe? We can't touch it. Our best neuroscientists, if they want to give any of this stuff that's sold in Colorado to animals in the lab, we can't do it. We can't look at the safety of these products in animals. People like me, clinical neuroscientists, who want to look at what's going on in the brain when a person has 2,000 nanograms per mil in their blood, we can't do that either, right? So it's a little bit like Mission Impossible, right? It's this interesting problem where universities have to make a choice. They have to choose between being compliant with federal law and abdicating their role in providing the public with critical safety and health information, or they serve the public and risk losing their federal funds, right? It's an impossible decision. And I put this picture up there. It's not a bad metaphor, actually, because you know what? The university has worked very closely with me. I mean, I have to say I have had great support. They're trying to thread the needle, right? And threading the needle means hanging me from wires while I work on my computer. That's what they're willing to do, and I appreciate that. You know, we're trying not to set off any federal alarms, but we're trying to get the safety and efficacy data that people need. So what needs to change? You know, clearly we need some congressional help here. We need a path for universities to conduct the research on the products that are actually being sold in their states, right? And what does that mean, a path? Well, it means either removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, which I read today McConnell said, no way is that going to happen. But, or providing some safe harbor for states to do research, right? There needs to be a path for states to do the research on safety and efficacy. And then one last point here too, the FDA also needs to provide some guidance to universities about, you know, how we can get approval at the FDA level to study products that are being sold in state-regulated markets, you know, in a way that eases that research. And then finally, NIH funds are critical here for understanding the health effects across a broad spectrum of disease states. So I thought I'd end where I started, right? Again, pointing out why we should care. It's a public health issue that impacts everybody. I'm sure you know somebody who's been impacted directly by this, whether it's a cancer patient or a veteran or a family with a child with epilepsy. So I'm going to make some acknowledgments and then stop there. I just wanted to recognize and thank our funding agencies, especially NIDA and CCIH, and also NIAAA for the alcohol research, and my collaborators, Angela Bryan and Cinnamon Bidwell, and others. All right, so thank you very much for coming, and thanks for your attention.